to the February 14th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting. I'd like to call this meeting to order. My name is Dan Isaacson, and I'm the chair of the Eugene Planning Commission. To begin this evening, I'd like to call on Commissioner Bailing for the city's land acknowledgement statement.
Since time immemorial, the Kalapuya people have been the indigenous stewards to our region, building dynamic communities, maintaining balance with wildlife, and enacting sustainable land practices. This land acknowledgement is a way of resisting the erasure of indigenous histories and to honor Native communities by inviting truth and reconciliation. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. As we consider the impacts of colonization, we also acknowledge the strength and resiliency of displaced indigenous people. The city of Eugene is built within the traditional homelands known as Kalapuya Ilihi. Kalapuya descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon. They continue to make contributions in our communities here and across the lands. We express our respect for the inherent political sovereignty of all federally recognized tribal nations and indigenous people who live in the state of Oregon and across the nation. Therefore, the Planning Commission recognizes that what we do today will affect the many generations who will come after us.
Thank you, Commissioner Bailing. And thanks to everyone who is joining us in this hybrid meeting format. Tonight, we are holding a work session to continue deliberations on the Willamette Greenway Code amendments, which include proposed changes to the city's land use code. Anyone wishing to watch our meeting can do so online or do so by following the instructions listed on the agenda for this meeting. Planning Commission meetings can also be viewed by watching the live stream available on our website or the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21. Because this work session is focused on our deliberations following the second public hearing on this topic, we will not be taking public comment for this evening. Before we start, I want to let you know a little bit about the Planning Commission and our role in the process. First, we are unpaid volunteers appointed by the Eugene City Council who all live and work in Eugene, and like many of you. For this code amendment project, we are not the decision makers. Rather, we will review the proposed amendments, take all testimony received to date and other relevant information and materials before making a final recommendation to the City Council. We also expect this process will require at least one or more meeting of deliberations, so we do not anticipate reaching any final recommendation tonight. Once we do reach a recommendation, the City Council will then hold their own public hearing and work sessions as needed for making a final decision on the proposed code amendments. We're at-large members, which means we have to consider the needs of our community as a whole, and as well as the needs of the group of all groups and neighborhoods. We're also human beings, which means each of us has our own personal views that make us who we are. But as planning commissioners, we're committed to balancing all of the needs as a community and making the best recommendations we possibly can based on our policies and our laws for us and for future generations. That can be pretty tough to do, and we know that not everyone will agree with every recommendation we make. So as we proceed this evening, we want to let you know up front that we are listening and that we care deeply about you and our community. We recognize how important these changes are and to encourage everyone participating in this process to do so in a respectful and productive way. One side note, I mentioned earlier, we are not taking public comment. The reason for that is we've already closed the open record period, which on January 20th, 2023. And that's been our policy in previous meetings as well. I know that there were some discussions earlier from other folks that wanted to suggest adding more comment. If you do provide public comment, it will go to the City Council for their own deliberations. So please continue to feel free to email any comment that you have in. And with that, I'd like to turn over to staff to help us get started on our discussion tonight.
Well, thank you and good evening, commissioners. I'm Gabe Flock, principal planner and the manager of the Willamette Greenway Code Amendments project. Tonight, we're continuing those deliberations following the second public hearing, which was held on January 10th. Tonight, we're going to dive in with a brief overview just to sort of set the stage and then focusing on a couple of key topic areas. one that we didn't have enough time to really dive into at the last meeting regarding public access points. We have some updated mapping and methodology to share and some proposed code revisions that we'd like the commission to consider. The other topic relates to native landscape buffering, and Jeff will talk a little bit more about that with some additional diagrams. We're also going to follow a similar we'll open up the floor for conversation and discussion and question and answer, just so that we got a full opportunity on each of those key topic areas. Necessary for the staff to be able to bring findings back. So the intent would be at the March 14th meeting that we would have enough specificity in the draft code to actually craft those findings and justify the requirements under Goal 15. We'll talk a little bit more about that as the meeting proceeds. At this point, I'll just note that we've got a good set of materials that we've provided. We won't necessarily be touching on all of these topics, but if there are questions, I think we'll have that opportunity toward the end of the meeting to bring a discussion forward around the materials in the packet.
Gabe, can I ask you to speak closer into your mic?
Okay.
Commissioner Ramey said you're cutting out.
Okay, the feedback I was concerned.
Yeah, well, maybe lean in close.
Okay,
We'll keep trying.
my apologies. All right, and so with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff, and we'll talk a little bit about background. And then dive into the key topic areas.
Great, thanks, Gabe. As a reminder for anybody, my name is Jeff Gepper. I'm a senior planner and here to provide some context for the Willamette River Greenway and Goal 15. I'm going to be pretty brief tonight, as we've discussed this on several occasions. I encourage anybody who's watching this evening for the first time regarding these code amendments to go watch our January 10th public hearing, where we do a pretty in-depth description of what these code amendments are, what Goal 15 is, and what the Willamette River Greenway is. Just as a brief refresher, the Willamette River Greenway, you can see on the map on the right, it's a boundary drawn to implement the intent of Goal 15, which is to ensure that development occurring within the Greenway is in coordination with the Willamette River, which is an asset throughout Oregon. So with that, I'll say that the purpose of these code amendments are very specific and intentional regarding some obligations under state law. So our goal here is to create a set of clear and objective approval criteria for housing development within the Willamette River Greenway. And again, this is to meet our obligations under state law. It's to try to maintain a balanced approach to protecting the Willamette River Greenway with effective development standards. And finally, to reduce barriers to housing development. Some of those proposed standards that are being implemented through the clear and objective proposal is a 100-foot greenway setback, a limit on the length of building facades, limitations on walls and fencings, and tree preservation requirements, native landscape buffering, and pedestrian access standards. I want to be really clear about some of the things that these code amendments do not do. So one, they don't change existing zoning or base zone development standards. They don't change existing adopted land use designations. They do not allow for more housing or density that wasn't already allowed under the current code. They don't move or change the existing greenway boundary. They don't remove any other existing environmental protections that exist within our codes. They don't reduce any area of any existing city-owned parkland, and they don't change any pathways or public parkland or restrict access in that way. So with that, I'm going to take us into some of the topics that we have for this evening. Now, in the memo that was provided to the Planning Commission as part of this agenda item summary, there were a number of topics covered in there. As Gabe mentioned, I'm not going to be covering all of those. I'm going to be covering some more of the salient topics that were identified for discussion. So the first one of those is around pedestrian access standards. And so this was standards was limited, and that was based on the fact that we were identifying public access points where they intersected the greenway boundary. And as Commissioner Bailing called out during our public hearing, after our public hearing, she identified the fact that something looked a little off. So upon revisiting it, we had our staff as well as our consultant go through and identify all those places in which our public pathways intersect with public right-of-way. And so that's really identifying those access points that do exist, both at the intersection of the greenway boundary and within the boundary itself. And so the one thing that you'll notice with the map on the screen is that those properties that were identified as being more than 500 feet away from a public access point are very few and far between. And the big takeaway for us doing this process, I mean, when I saw this map personally, was the fact that we have really great access to our riverfront path system, and the network is actually rather robust. And I will say that we used a different methodology. That methodology is outlined in a really clear way in the set of materials. We had that laid out, and really it used a walking analysis as opposed to straight line distance. And so because of that, we proposed some changes to how that code is actually intended to operate.
Yeah, bring the microphone.
Yeah. Right.
We'll get it.
Hello.
You got it right. Eventually.
So and this is not intended for you to be able to read, obviously, on the screen here. This was provided in the AIS. These changes are really intended to make things even more clear and objective. And so originally the code was relying on that 500-foot distance being measured from a straight line distance from a public access point. To make it more clear for folks, what we decided to do is, well, if we already did all of this good mapping work, the concept was to incorporate that map into our adopted set of maps. And that map will say, is your property further than 500 feet or not further? It's very clear, it's very black and white, it's very objective in that way. And so the proposed changes that you see here both cover that change where we incorporate this map into our digital set of maps. And it also changes to make sure that things are very clear in terms of constitutionality and our ability to make these requirements. And so with that, before I move on to the next topic, I will open it up to the commission for any questions regarding these proposed changes.
Commissioner Beeson.
I found myself focusing in on the, I found myself focusing in on the constitutionality. So I don't need to go too far with this. Not sure what to do. I think I'm going to direct this to Lauren, but it sounds like it. So this is language proposed to go into the code, and our code has findings and legal opinions that support it, and it goes into effect, and then it's administered over time. And so somebody develops a piece of property that's more than 500 feet away and meets this criteria, triggers all of this. I'm just curious about that wording. It seems to me on anything that anyone would apply to do, part of the process through the public hearing and the findings and so on would be being sure it passes legal muster and meets the city requirements and state and so on. So I'm not quite grokking why, look at my microphone, but why this is kind of pulled out from the code I've seen over 4 years with that word.
Commissioner Beeson, thank you for that question.
Okay.
So that wording is present in other development standards that allow the city to make exactions. So that is a situation where the city is asking a developer to build infrastructure or to give the city title to real property that they otherwise would own. The city has the ability to take property using eminent domain, but the Constitution says that if the city takes private property for public use, we need to pay for it. Or if we can make constitutional findings that there is a nexus between the proposed development and the required, in this case, access way, and the work done by the property owner is sort of roughly proportional to the proposed development, then we can ask the property owner to build that access way and for public use and not pay for it. So those are the constitutional findings that the code is referring to. And that language does exist in other places.
Okay. So I don't necessarily want to interchange legal and constitution.
Right. This is a specific constitutional requirement for the city has to make specific constitutional findings for the city to be able to require a property owner to do something like build a public access way.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Has a question. I think you're going to tell me that I can't see behind me as to who's, so if someone could play back up here, if someone's requested to speak.
Commissioner Ramey has his hand.
Commissioner Ramey, please.
Thank you. Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Terrific. Okay. Occasionally the mics are cutting out because you're leaning back a little bit, and when it cuts out, it just cuts out completely. So it goes to blank until you lean back into the mic. So I don't know what else to tell you except keep leaning into your mics. About the access way, the concept is that we would provide the public access from a public right-of-way to the Greenway pathway system. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Wow.
Sorry.
Okay. I didn't realize I'd stump you right away there. Then on the map, if we can go back to the map, some of the red properties do not actually touch the riverfront pathway system, I think. Particularly on the right-hand side there, some of those red properties are not going to be able to create what I just described, a pathway from a right-of-way to the pathway system.
That is correct. And for that reason, you will see that within that code standard, it does provide us the ability to, the city may, we're suggesting a change that says the city may require this. So in those instances where there is no benefit or the ability for, quite frankly, for the city to demonstrate that there's a reason for us to have that, we wouldn't apply that standard in those cases.
I'll also provide a little additional context, if I may, Commissioner Ramey. So in reading the standard, it talks about where it extends from the property line of a development site to existing public ways that provide a connection to or along the Willamette. So if it's physically separated from where that connection along the river may exist, we would not be able to apply the standards. So it would take it out of applicability in that sense.
So is that the phrase that says publicly owned land? It's abutting publicly owned land. Is that phrase?
No, it actually refers, the phrase I was reading refers to public access ways that already exist along the river. So we're really referring to that regional bike path system. Right. But so if they're physically separated from that, it's not feasible to connect from the development site to that path where it exists along the river. The standard wouldn't apply.
Okay, so I would suggest that we either add another color or remove those red ones from that map that aren't going to apply, just because it's confusing. It confuses me, and I think if you do that, then there will be a tiny number of properties that this actually applies to.
We can definitely look at that and bring back the map. I think, part of the question here is, I think for staff, with the limited number of properties whether or not the standard really has much utility, but I think that we need a little more guidance on exactly where, and so we need to study up on where those physical preclusions, sort of the lack of feasibility to connect exists such that we pull them off the map. We'd also need to adjust the methodology as well.
Well, I think since we started with clear and objective as our goal, maybe we should do that.
And I would just add that there's also the chance that the path system does change and that there would be a circumstance in which, you know, perhaps those properties do at some point would have to do that if they later develop. I mean, we see the system as it is today, but there is potential for change. So it's you know, providing that modicum of flexibility within the city's ability to require it when it's providing that utility is why we're proposing it the way it is.
Commissioner Edwards?
Okay, I'm gonna ask a question. Thank you. And I apologize, and I might be bringing us back. I was not here. I did watch the last meeting, so great job, everybody, by the way.
And the public
Okay.
hearing.
Sorry?
And the public hearing, you watched.
Yes. Yes. I feel like I was at the public hearing. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't.
Just missed one meeting, but, okay, so my question is, so the black dots represent current access points
Yes.
or required, okay. And so then the red properties are subject to providing additional access points if development were to occur. Is that what you're saying?
And if, based on the provision, we provide the justification under constitutional requirements, as Lauren described, so the
Right.
Dolan findings, as we call them. And also depending on whether or not it's actually feasible to provide that connection to an existing path system that provides a connection to and along the river.
So maybe it would be helpful to kind of go through the methodology from the top. I know that it's in the AIS, but tell me if I'm wrong. This is my understanding of the current proposal for public access ways. So in order for the public access way requirements to apply at all, the proposed development has to result in 5 or more dwelling units on a development site. So you have to be building at least 5 dwelling units, or there will be 5 dwelling units on the site at the end of the development. And has to be out more than 500 feet from one of those proposed access points. Those are the red properties. So if one of those red properties is developed with 5 or more dwelling units, then theoretically the public access standards would apply if the city can make the constitutional findings that there is a nexus between the development and the public access way, and the public access way to be constructed from the development site to the current path system is roughly proportional to the amount of use and impact on the city's current infrastructure. So there's a multi-tiered analysis, but the red properties are the only properties that possibly could be required to develop these public access ways. That requirement won't be triggered unless the development results in 5 or more dwelling units and the city can make the required constitutional findings. Is that right?
That's right. Thank you.
And the required constitutional findings are based on whether or not there's a perceived taking because we're requiring them to create a pathway.
Yes.
And one that is public.
And so this language is clear and objective?
Yes, there is actually some current case law out of the city of Tigard where the city of Tigard imposed some code language that is a little bit different than this, but resulted in the same analysis, same constitutional analysis. And the Land Use Board of Appeals said that that was clear and objective because it's a federal constitutional requirement.
Great.
Or actually, I'm sorry, that's not. The real analysis was the federal constitutional requirement trumps the state law clear and objective requirement. So you got to do the constitutional analysis.
So just to summarize, somebody decides to build a multifamily unit on the red triangle, basically the middle of the page to the below by Valley River Center. They meet the requirements for a public access way. The developers have to pay to build a path from the development lot boundary to the bike path or the park.
From the entrance, it says.
Right. That path cannot be impeded. It has to be a public access point.
Correct.
So it can't have someone put a lock on it for only the people who are in that multifamily unit. That has to now become a public access point, much like all the rest of the black dots are on there.
Correct.
Okay.
There's a separate requirement for access ways within the development site. But that is separate. So there's a requirement under some circumstances for private paths within the development site. But what we're talking about is public access ways that would be open to the public and outside of the development site.
What's the difference in terms of the standards?
If I may, the subsection of code under access that just precedes this piece about public access ways speaks to where a property abuts publicly owned land, and it requires that paths be provided within the development site and from those buildings on the site to the edge of the property where it abuts the public land. So that would be a case where it's a private path in the direction of the river and it ends at the line adjacent to the public property.
So in that scenario, if that were to happen, still within the same red triangle there, they would not be building a path from the edge of the development to the bike path. They would simply be putting a gate on their property that they have built and allowing access from in and out of that gate by residents or whomever they give the licensing appropriation to.
It is a potential outcome if we're just looking at that first subsection with pathways on the development site to the edge nearest the river.
Okay, is there a way both exist? So in other words,
Right. So I did want to speak to that scenario in which it could be that both standards apply and the private pathways are required within the development site to get folks to the edge of the property, and then it becomes a public access way which extends to the bike path along the river. So it could certainly be possible for both standards to kick in and require that continuity through the site and then also off-site to the river.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can't see behind me. That's, Commissioner Beckler.
Yeah, so just to clarify, all pathways on public land will be open and accessible to the public, correct?
That's correct. Yes.
And will these pathways have to be paved? Is that a requirement?
Good question. And so the answer is yes, in order to meet our public improvement standards adopted by the city for what we call a public access way, and to meet the multi-use standard for the 10 feet, it has to be paved with concrete.
And that's because of accessibility for diverse abilities.
Correct.
That actually brings up two questions then for me. One, and I saw your hand, I'm sorry. The distance between site and path can be all over the place, right? Having a path is one thing. Is a requirement that it be lit? Because there's lighting stands along the pathway. Does that extend in?
I don't believe it's a requirement. However, I know that our Parks Department is actively reviewing and in some cases improving lighting along the public path system. There are portions that are not. And so this code standard would not require that it be lit.
Okay. And then the second thing is, if the person has the private access, right? So they same scenario we just discussed, and they wanted to have a path put in between, is that something that they can do, and who pays for that?
There are scenarios that I have experienced in the past where a developer may wish to provide that and partner with the Public Works Department, Parks and Open Space staff to potentially participate in cost sharing and permitting processes to accomplish that goal together.
Mr. Edwards.
Thanks. Well, an observation, the two parks closest to me, city parks, have zero lighting in them. And I don't know if that was intentional, but I just, like you were asking about lighting. I've often thought that was bizarre, but that, I believe that's by design, so I'm not sure.
Oh.
You know, I'm not sure, but anyhow, my question. As I think about public beaches, other rivers that are accessible by the public, I mean, in Oregon, we don't own the beach. We, the public, that is accessible to the public. It feels like we have a lot of access points, and it feels a bit like there's a lot of extra requirements above and beyond to a private owner of, I mean, this could be, 5 units, it could be not a major development. And so I'm just kind of wondering where the standard came from. Like, where did we decide that we needed to have access? Where is that in something else that I just missed? I'm just kind of curious. I'm just asking.
It's a great question. In fact, the requirement for dedication of public access ways exists in a variety of application types and within our public improvement standards. So in most instances that we're looking at a proposed subdivision, plan unit development, site review, that same standard, very similar, although it's customized for the Greenway, given these circumstances and the clear and objective nature of it and everything. That standard is pretty regular and applies across the board in many cases. So even I can imagine scenarios where a Greenway permit has a companion application type, and we would have the ability to require that dedication. I'd also just point out that part of the reason we're focused on this standard is really, again, relating back to the intent of Goal 15 and one of its key focuses in providing public access to the river.
And I'll just add further, just that this also we're trying to draw parity between the discretionary track and the clear and objective track, so that requirement to be consistent with Goal 15 is to provide that access to and along the river. So if it exists in the discretionary track, it really, we feel, is important to have that a similar provision or requirement exists within the clear and objective track.
I believe Commissioner Ramey's behind me, wanting to speak. Correct.
Thank you. I think Chair Isaacson brought up one of my sort of the concept, the question I had earlier about, and I think, Gabe, you mentioned that it was going to be judged whether it was feasible or not to connect the public access to the public pathway. And I'm just a little nervous that the term feasible is not necessarily clear and objective. But some of these properties are going to be a long way from the bike path, and some may be right next door to the bike path. And at what point, how does the staff, how does anyone interpret what feasible means for the creation of that connection?
And my response to that would be to really focus on the language of the code standard itself. And so while I use the term feasible in a general sense, it's really the code standard that prevails. And it really speaks to properties where, the public access way would extend from the property line of the development to existing public ways that provide a connection to or along the Willamette River. And so that is the set of facts and circumstances we'd have to look at with each parcel, is whether or not there's an existing public way that extends to or along the river. And so that would then be what helps staff interpret whether we can invoke this standard. And to that end, I think there is an analysis that's required each time we look at a particular case, and the suggestion of reevaluating that and potentially pulling certain properties off the map would provide a clearer way and would front load that analysis. But I also think that there's value in having this standard applicable on a case-by-case basis so that we can look at situations where there might still be gaps in the system, and we can actually invoke that.
Well, I'm just thinking of things like geography. There may be, ups and downs that you have to go across. There may be wetlands that you have to go across. There may be significant vegetation between your property and the pathway, and all of those are going to weigh into whether it's feasible or not. And that's why I'm not sure how you make it clear and objective. I'm not sure how a developer would have certainty if we weren't somehow more clear about this.
Commissioner Ramey, it's a good question. And again, Gabe, you can chime in if I'm missing something, but my understanding is that, if one of those red properties wants to develop, then the analysis that we're doing is the constitutional rough proportionality analysis. And if the connection is so long or so cumbersome that it's not roughly proportional to the development, then the city wouldn't be able to make the necessary constitutional findings. And so we wouldn't require the public access way. It's not really a matter of, is there, a particular issue? Is it X number of feet away? Is there a wetland? It's just, is what we would need to build to get from the development site to the bike path roughly proportional to the impact of the development? And if it's not, then the city wouldn't be able to require the developer to build that path. The city could buy the property and build the path, or build the path itself, but.
And there's case law that describes, you've used the word proportional a couple times there. So there's
Yep.
case law that describes what that is.
Yes.
Commissioner Lear?
Yeah, Commissioner Ramey's question was getting right to what I wanted to know more about, and I appreciate you elaborating. I guess I'd ask kind of a further, deeper follow-up about what does constitute that proportionality. And I mean, is a developer just going to assume that if they're 499 feet away from that access point that they're building the path? Or, what is that decision going to be made based on, or that analysis going to be conducted to determine that it's proportional?
So they would need to be more than 500 feet away from the public access point for the standard to apply. And the rough proportionality analysis is a case-by-case analysis. And it is something that there is a fair amount of case law on. It's something that the city does on a regular basis. Public works staff assists with making those findings. And the city has to be able to make those defensible findings. I can't tell you that it's, there's no particular distance, there's no particular impact of development that means, you're in or out in terms of an exaction finding.
So are you just looking at the cost then and saying that somehow lines up with how many units or what the cost of the overall development is? Just give me a little more sense of what that analysis is based on. Yeah,
a lot of it comes down to cost.
Okay.
And the number of people that will be added to the site and will be using the city's infrastructure.
Commissioner Freckler?
So when I think about this change to the code, it seems to me like it's an attempt to decrease the impact of some of these properties, to possibly have to build something that's very costly, right? And so I appreciate the change in language in terms of, making it possible that some of these properties may not have to build a pathway. Some of them may still have to build a pathway. But there are other pieces around this that I think needs to be addressed and be clarified, because, there's a lot of public interest in the fact that pathways are public, right? And I think we all understand that any pathway on a public land must be open to the public. It's on public land, so it'll be public. And that a pathway within a development to the edge of the property may not be public. So what happens at the interface of the public land and the private land? I mean, may there be a gate there to prevent people from entering into the private land? Because, in some instances, in parts of these, the community living along the river, we've heard that they have concerns about access to their private spaces. And I personally do believe this is a separate conversation about the, unhoused community. the impacts of people being unhoused, the impacts of mental health, lack of mental health resources in our community. And I do believe they need to be addressed at that level. I don't want to stigmatize those communities, but at the same time, I want us to be sensitive to the issues that people living along the river do have to put up with. You know, it is an impact on their life. And I want us to be sensitive to that. So what I'm saying is I can understand why a private development would not want a gate to be open to a public path. So do these public paths just terminate at the private property? How does that work?
Well, again, where the standards would work together, I could see a situation in which a private path system could be gated at the edge of the property, and then it becomes public, be offsite at that point. But there's nothing in this proposed code that would preclude or require that it be gated. If that helps to answer the question, it would be property owners.
So there's nothing in this code that prevents the private property owner from gating the path once it's on their property.
Correct. However, if we are solely looking at the public access way requirement and requiring that through the public, from the public property through the site to an adjacent public way, or like River Road or one of the adjacent streets, then it would need to be maintained as being open and fully accessible to the public.
And does a developer have the option to build a pathway that connects to a road that then connects to the river? I mean, when I hear you read that language, to me, it sounds like they can build a pathway or even some type of road within their development that connects to a road that then goes to the river, and then they would not need to build a pathway. Is that correct?
I believe you're correct.
Okay, great. So I'm understanding correctly. Good for me. So I'm just trying to be sensitive to both sides, and I do think that this additional language is moving in a good direction.
Thank you.
So I'm back to lighting. And when what we just heard from Commissioner Freckler, the concerns that folks have, you buy a house, there's no access way to the bike path. 20 years later, now all of a sudden there's development, now there is. That wasn't something that somebody considered when they bought a house on the street. Maybe they should have, maybe they shouldn't have, but now it's a concern. And so lighting that path between the bike path and not could ease some of the tensions that could arise, as opposed to this dark pathway that leads into my backyard or my front yard. So is there a way to write into the code that the pathway that we're requiring must be lit?
You know, I'd want to study that a little closer. One of the things I'd like to bring back is more information about the public improvement standards and when and where and how they approach the lighting question. We've actually experienced it on, on both sides of the coin, where we've actually had an appeal with opponents frustrated with the city's proposal to light the path. I believe that's actually an example related to the West Bank. And so there was objection to having that lighting, even though we do have outdoor lighting standards that limit the amount of lumens, the brightness of the lighting and the spacing of it and all that. And so there are standards that exist in the code, generally speaking, to pathway lighting, but it's really more focused, I think, on shielding, spacing, and particularly where it limits the brightness in habitat areas. So I'd want to come back with more information on what the implications are. It's certainly add cost, and it's not common in any of our other land use application requirements to have a standard that would speak to lighting in such a precise way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Commissioner.
Yeah, I in terms of lighting, I'm understanding what you're asking or what you're saying. I think when I think of citywide and I think of roads and bike paths and paths in any public way, there's a real kind of wide range of whether things are lit or not. And my own experience with it going back, I think a number of years ago, we used to light the city, we lit a lot of things. And when I think of things being lit or not, it comes down to resources and money for sure. And I think as Gabe was saying, or, you know, there's quite a range of reactions amongst people in the community as to whether they want lights. That's always a factor. So I don't know. I think when you go down that road, it's something that does need to be looked at and thought about, but I live on a street that's fairly long and it has one light, you know, on the whole street. So anyway, just a comment. I think lighting is a kind of an area that needs a lot of looking and it needs a lot of money. So.
Right. Well, we can definitely bring back more information. At this point, we're not necessarily looking at changing code to be able to try to invoke that standard. Understood.
And if we could just take a brief break, we're gonna share this mic and we're gonna unplug yours because I think yours is having some audio problems. So everybody close your ears if you're listening.
Thank you. That wasn't bad.
You just make sure you.
Well, while that's going on, I totally understand and respect the position on that. I walk with my son and partner on River Road. We purposely choose exits that have a lit path.
Yeah.
And I know when she walks over there with her son, she would only choose that. It feels very ominous to have gone over there at 4 p.m., 5 p.m. and it's dusk and it's still fine. And then you're out there a little bit too long and then you start to come back and now it's gotten a lot darker than you expected to choose the path that is totally pitch black as opposed to as to lit. I will go up another 500 feet to choose that one. I know that she would too. So having it be part of the dialogue, I get that there's people on both sides, but have people weigh in, but there's definitely both sides of the argument for sure. For sure,
And I am very curious about that issue because I have asked that question of staff with our parks division, why the parks are, and I've been told it, you know, has to do with wildlife, has to do with, you know, various reasons that they don't like the parks. So at night they aren't, you know, a place that folks are congregating or whatever else you want to call it. But I would like to know the answer to that question as well. But to me, there was a rationale behind it. And so I'm curious to know how that would apply.
Also issue of light pollution anywhere that there's native habitat or natural reserves. And
that is exactly what
it's a big issue.
Yeah.
So I think we've exhausted this particular topic.
Right. Not tonight.
Is this map in the AIS?
Yeah. That's right here.
I don't know.
I've been scrolling.
It's in one of the furthest exhibits at the very back.
Oh, it's at the very end, right? Okay, it's an appendix. I was just looking at that section. I did want to say I really agree. We have a very robust access to the river, so it's not like people can't get to the river. And that's a good thing.
You have additional topics.
So the next conversation is around the native landscape buffer, which as a reminder is the as proposed 10-foot wide landscaping strip that would run along the length of the greenway setback on the non-river side of the greenway setback. And it would be landscaped at a level of L2. And L2 is canopy trees as well as 30 inches to 42 inches of shrubs, and then 70% of native ground, the ground being covered with native plantings. There had been conversations previously about the difference of whether we should apply L2 versus L3. L3 is a higher level of screening. It's 6-foot high shrubs that provide a much more continuous screen in terms of visual impact. And then we also provided reference to the native and non-native plant list, and we've provided information previously about the list we proposed to use, which was from our goal 5 provisions actually that were researched back in the day. And we had our consultant, which includes a large amount of landscape architects and professionals in that field, take a look at these standards for us and kind of judge whether or not, one, is there existing code context and basis for the 10-foot wide landscape strip. And they did provide context for that as to why 10 feet does provide the necessary space. And then also looking at whether or not there's that context for code to be provided. And they did find that as well. And the one thing that I would just say is that it's in the memo as well. Staff is more regularly accustomed actually to the 7-foot landscape bed, which is provided around all our parking areas, which supports the L2 plantings, which, all across Eugene has demonstrated to support whatever living plant material is required in that context. And so we feel would be also totally fine for this landscape, for the native landscape buffer to be 7 feet and provide the same amount of utility in terms of screening. And then finally, there were a lot of questions around what would happen when you're looking at properties that are particularly close to the bike path. And so there really aren't many instances of this around the city. And so I pulled these kind of quick maps together. So I'm just going to explain what we're looking at here. And we're actually over in the River Road neighborhood. And these are 4 properties that are identified as either partially developed or undeveloped. And they are they're designated for medium density residential. So we can expect some level of density to occur on these properties whenever the iterative process of development means they develop. And so on the right-hand side, I'm showing the tree preservation zones, which you cannot see my cursor currently up there, which is too bad. But you can see where the greenway setback actually, anything to the right-hand side or the river side towards the bike path of the greenway setback, that's the no-go zone for structures and development other than the public access ways that could be required. And then beyond that, you have the landscape buffer that we're discussing tonight. And then on the left-hand side, what I did was I provided a buffer from approximately the edge of pavement for 50 feet and 100 feet from the bike path itself. And, in this location, which is pretty indicative of any kind of area that this is happening, or one of the few that it actually happens, you'll see that the 50-foot buffer line actually pretty well matches with the areas that are within the greenway setback. So we're not actually looking at really any structures being located in that area. And then the 100-foot buffer is pretty close to where the greenway setback is itself. So I just wanted to provide this, there were lots of questions around it, and I wanted to provide this as a really quick analysis that tried to pull together and provide you with some additional context for spacing and what that could look like on a property by property basis. And that'll conclude my discussion on landscape buffers. If there are any questions.
Commissioner Edwards.
I have a question. Thank you, because I did listen to, as I mentioned, I listened to the last meeting, and there was a lot of conversation about this. And Commissioner Isaacson had made a suggestion to put the buffer at the property line. I'm curious because I've actually never seen a scenario where you're buffering a property from a beach or a river or anything else like that. I'm wondering if this is common throughout our state or anywhere else, because I'm just, trying to think of other areas that I've traveled or walked a river path. And there are a lot of dwellings and other structures and whatnot, sometimes a business, sometimes, and I'm just kind of curious where this came from and is this whole screening idea. I think that it sounds like it is intended to be protective, but at the same time, I'm just wondering, like, if you were actually in the space, if you were physically traveling down the bike lane or the bike path, and all of a sudden you're kind of in this weird sort of a tunnel type of thing, would that actually be a desirable experience. And so I'm curious if you could shed some light on where this may be coming from.
And thank you. It's a great question. So one of the things we've talked about in deliberations and throughout this process is bringing consistency or parity between our discretionary track applications and the clear and objective. And really, the standard for providing screening and maximizing the preservation of vegetation along the river comes straight out of Goal 15. And we have a comparable standard in the discretionary track application process that requires a maximum amount of landscaping between the activity in the river. And so we felt this was a good way to really tie the requirement for screening and vegetation to a development, in proximity to the river. And it provides a comparable standard that helps us meet the intent of Goal 15 with this clear and objective track. So this is a tool that we've proposed. It's new in Eugene, but it's actually more precise than the subjective criteria for greenway permits we've used for some 40 years.
Okay,
Yeah.
follow up. So if you are, I'm going to use this example. Oh, it's over here. So if you're one of these properties here and you decide to develop under the clear and objective standards, I'll say you're kind of in the middle, and everybody around you decides it's too restrictive, we're going to go discretionary tract. So you have a screening buffer, but then the other 4 properties, they've, for whatever reason, their provisions did not incorporate that because they decided to go with a subjective track.
Right. That is.
So is that a feasible outcome?
It's a possible outcome related to the property owner's choice of when to develop, what track they use. It does, I think from staff's perspective, give us a clear, specific, simple way to meet the standard that's tied to the actual development we're reviewing, but it does not ensure that kind of continuity I think you're describing. But we did really look closely at where and how the buffer should be located. And after exploring that in a number of different ways, we're confident that its location along the greenway setback line and on the landward side from the river makes the most sense, just in terms of its screening benefits.
So rather than the property line.
Right. Commissioner Freckle.
I mean, in this case, wouldn't the property line actually put it right next to the bike path? In these cases?
No.
Where, I mean, the property line. So is the gray thing the bike path?
So the bike path is the gray.
Right, and then the pink is the property line?
Right.
So if we put it at the property line, it would actually be right next to the bike path. But in this case, it's going to be farther away. Yeah. Okay. Well, I just want to go back to the 10-foot buffer zone. I appreciate that staff followed up on the context for the, justification of 10 feet. I certainly am not in support of reducing it from 10 feet. I understand that we're used to screening parking lots with 7 feet, but in this case, I do hope there's the river's on a higher value level than a parking lot. And, I'm supportive of keeping it to 10 feet.
If I may, just to explain kind of how this standard actually operates, because it sounds like it's 10 feet of landscaping, but really it's a line of shrubs, and then everywhere else within that 10 feet is just 70% covering of native vegetation of some kind. So having the additional 3 feet is really more of a way of extending that setback and ensuring that, rather than just having additional screening. So I know that you understand that. I just want to make sure that everybody understands how that standard works.
Thank you for the clarification.
Commissioners Ramey and Lear both have their hands up.
Commissioner Lear, please.
Yeah, so how does the requirement for native landscape been applied on the discretionary tract and in those applications in recent years?
What I would suggest is that in most situations, and as a practitioner, that it's subjective, but it results in some form of landscape buffering, not specifically to the L2 or L3 standard. It's situational. It depends on the case, proximity to the river, a whole bunch of factors, also including the development itself in terms of height and location. So, but the subjective criteria do give us the ability to condition approval on providing that landscape screening.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ramey?
So I'm back to the point I brought up at the last meeting was 10 feet is not paralleled in the code anywhere except as a setback. And 7 feet has to do with a landscape buffer. So I wonder if our problem is we've confused these two ideas. And if one of them shouldn't be
So
setback, but it's a 7-foot screening requirement.
And so the comparable example that we did find, the very specific one was actually in the E1 or E2 zone where residential is adjacent to industrial. And yeah, it says it does have a sort of a combined function, if you will, in terms of buffering with distance and screening. But that was an example that we thought was important to bring forward in terms of it including a screening requirement, not just setback.
Yeah, well, I guess that's the challenge for me is that 7 feet is tried and true throughout the whole city when we're talking about screening, and it works, and the report says that it works, and it's what we're used to as a community. So how we get an extra 3 feet, unless we call it a setback, then maybe that's what we should do.
So just to clarify, the memo we got from Cameron McCarthy, and it is in the packet, does actually describe and justify the 10-foot width with regard to the native species and the L2 standard. It was actually staff's suggestion within the agenda item summary that the other comparable standards for L2 are adjacent to parking lots. So it's either 10 based on the landscape architecture firm's sort of professional opinion and looking at that plant species list, or alternatively, staff sees a justification for 7 feet in existing code without really entering into the realm of being arbitrary.
And as I recall, the consultant said 7 feet would work.
The consultants did find that 10 feet would work. It was staff, me, who said 7 feet would work.
Well, but did the consultant say that 7 feet would not work?
They did not say that. They were focused on the 10 feet as proposed in the code.
So I'm sorry, but if we asked them 11 feet, would they say that, or 9 feet? Again, if we're clear and objective, we need to be clear and objective, and we have to have reasons for why we're doing what we're doing.
And we're confident that the 10 feet is clear and objective. It's measurable. It's a standard that'll work.
I think we're coming to the point where staff's recommendation is 10 feet. If it's the commission's decision to go with 7 and the majority of the commission wants to do 7, then we can easily rewrite the code to make it 7. We just need commission direction at this point. And I heard from Commissioner Fragola, she likes 10. I think I'm hearing from Commissioner Ramey that he would prefer 7.
Commissioner Beeson?
I think Commissioner Lear was ahead of me.
Oh, okay. Well, I believe he went first, then went Ramey, and then
I withdrew. Thank you.
Oh, he withdrew. Okay.
Okay.
Briefly,
trying desperately to.
I'm a little torn on this one. I found though, I guess I'm kind of agreeing with Commissioner Fragola. I kind of like, and staff, I guess I like the 10 feet. I've liked it all along. I found Commissioner Ramey's discussion at the last meeting and at this meeting pretty compelling in terms of keeping it consistent with the code. I've been hearing that about a lot of things as we do this, sort of staff kind of looking for a variety of reasons, looking to find on these things some consistency. So I guess when it gets out, it's being applied by the staff and so on. I'm not sure how big a deal it is one way or the other. I guess I find myself thinking, if there's some sense that somebody would appeal this or have an issue and we have trouble putting it into the findings to justify the 10 feet, I guess I'm not seeing or hearing that you guys that that's an issue. So I'd sort of, if you thought that was an issue, I'd probably go with 7, but otherwise I will go with 10.
Thank you, Commissioner Beeson. I don't believe that that staff anticipates a difficulty in making findings for either of those widths. And I would also point out that the Planning Commission is making a recommendation that will go to the council. Council will have the opportunity to hear from folks in the community about whether they think 7 or 10 feet is the correct distance. So this is not the end of the line. Planning Commission just needs to give staff some direction so staff can write the code and you can make your recommendation and we can move through the process with much more opportunity for public involvement.
So I'm going to throw myself back in the queue. Then I've got Edwards, Commissioner Bailey. This is a great map. This is a new map, which is great. As I'm sure you all are aware, I like maps, but I think that this map does a good job of highlighting the argument that essentially both options are the same thing. Do we have a map where this is not the rule? In other words, where the bike path, because of all the setbacks, when you lay down there, comes right up against where the buffer would be. And back to Commissioner Ramey's suggestion, the previous meeting, is there an argument to have code specific to those properties? My argument would be if there's a significant number of them, yes. If we're talking about 2 properties, then no. But until we see it, right? And this is a fairly long strip. If these are the only 4 properties where this is the model, but the rest of them they're the other way, now we have a problem, right? So do we have any maps or properties that we can look at and give any color to that?
I don't have any maps prepared that illustrate that explicitly. I don't know the utility of trying to scroll through because I mean the online web map does show kind of the proximity roughly of the bike path to the greenway setbacks. We could go through that this evening if there's enough time and just identify any other areas that you guys that the commission is interested in looking at. But I don't know if that's feasible in this setting.
Sure. I would just say that before we have our next meeting, if we could have, for me, I'd like to be able to know, is this a one-off? Is this a regular occurrence? Because this is a common complaint.
So I can answer that question, which is that this is a rare occurrence. This is one of the few examples that I was able to find where this actually occurs. The other location that this occurs is along a property that's R1, and the setback is actually significantly occupies that property. So
just to be clear, what's on the screen is rare, or what I'm suggesting is rare?
What is on the screen is the rare situation in which the bike path comes, near the property lines themselves. In most cases, the bike path is pretty far away from actual property boundaries and is mostly located on public land.
Okay. Just to be clear, I don't think that's close to the bike path is close to it. My concern is that green line is up against the bike path, right? So the scenario, I can't remember who was saying it. They're walking along, and all of a sudden, it's a big open field of the bike path. And now, because we have a new development, they're walking through this tunnel of trees that we've required the development to do. That wouldn't happen here in this scenario. So I'm wondering how many properties of those have the potential to happen, and it doesn't sound like it's that often or at all.
No, I don't believe that would be a common occurrence.
Okay. Actually, it was Commissioner Edwards, excuse me. Sorry.
It's okay. Okay. So question is, at what point in time does it need to measure 10 feet? Because trees and shrubs they grow. So when you plant them, they're not going to be 10 feet, but at some point, they'll be 10 feet. So that's question number 1. As a comment, 10 feet is like 2 of me end to end, right? That's a lot of space. That's like 3 rows of arborvitae. Not that I'm seeing that on this list, but I feel like that, and if it's intended to be a visual barrier, 10 feet seems like a lot that could be established otherwise, but I know where it came from, a recommendation from our consultants, but I definitely feel like it seems like a very thick amount of space to accomplish essentially a screening, and different shrubs will do that differently. And so I guess I don't know that 10 feet is necessary. There are rooms in my house that are 10 feet by 10 feet. That seems like a big area to have to cover with something that is intended to block out a visual, without being able to penetrate visual. But the bigger question is, at what point does it have to measure 10 feet? Because it's going to grow. You have to maintain it at 10 feet. When they first planted, it
Well,
probably won't be 10 feet.
Yeah, at the point at which the city reviews an application for a Willamette River Greenway permit under these standards, we would require that the site plan demonstrate and show that width at the proper location, and also include a planting plan. So it's conceptual at that time, right? But they
okay.
would have to demonstrate they've chosen the right species from the native plants list. They have some flexibility in that in terms of choice, but it also, it includes ground cover. It includes a row of shrubs that are between 30 and 42 inches, and then canopy trees every 30 feet linear, right? So that would be something they'd have to demonstrate compliance with at the time of their application.
As a clear and objective standard, correct?
Correct. In this.
That doesn't seem clear and objective to me, but you're
What
telling me, well, because that's a lot of subjective thing. Well, here's the plan and we're going to maintain these and they're going to grow and it's going to fill up 10 feet. And
Commissioner Edwards, just to clarify, I think
Sure.
it's the landscape area that needs to be 10 feet in width.
okay.
We're not requiring necessarily that each piece of landscaping fill up that entire area. So there's, as Gabe was saying, there are big trees every 30
Yeah.
feet. There are some shrubs, there are some low areas. That 10-foot width has to be devoted to native landscaping, but you don't have to say that on this day, it will be completely full side to side with the native landscape, or, one arborvitae will fill it up. That's not what we're asking for.
Yeah, and it's like at the time of plant, they have to do this within 3 years of being planted, and then they have to be maintained at that height. So if
Time to grow.
And what if they don't? I mean, do we go back out in 3 years and check, or?
it's usually a code compliance issue. So if it were something that were,
Driven.
yeah, if
Commissioner Bailing, and then I'm going to put myself back.
Just relying on my personal experience using the pathways, I feel where development is close to the pathway, like at Good Pasture Island, where you can't walk the path without talking to someone who's living there, pretty much. I believe the draw of the river is the connection with nature, and having some separation from development is a good thing. I'm definitely in favor of 10 feet. I know it's not a solid barrier, and you wouldn't want a solid barrier. The whole idea is the feeling of openness and space and connection with nature. And some places, as you walk or bike the path, are kind of wild grasses, and others have a lot of trees. And it's beauty for me, in part, is in that variety. But I much prefer the vegetation to the immediate connection to development. So that's my vote. Thanks.
I think we have broad consensus on 10 feet. I'll just chime in and say that I'm glad that Commissioner Edwards said it first. If we're setting these rules and then it falls in the compliance department, if you spend any time talking to folks in the neighborhood, that is not a winning argument. And that the feeling is going to be that if we can get 10 in the code and we end up with 7 that's actually enforced, then great. Versus 7, and then all of a sudden it drops down to 3, and then we have to go through compliance issues. So I'll stick with 10. That's my thoughts. And
Commissioner Lear.
We need to have it on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, it's more of a process consideration that Commissioner Ramey brought up. But I guess it's the question is just, what is the basis for the 10 rather than some other standard? So I would guess I'd direct this toward to Jeff and ask, if you thought 7 was satisfactory, would meet the requirement, what advantage does 10 give?
It's a larger setback from the river. It provides for greater levels of vegetation, which is one of the things that the that goal 15 is focused on is providing, the maximum amount of landscaping in between, development and the river. So it's just providing that increased level of coordination and protection.
I think we're on to the next topic unless anybody else. Okay.
And so, it's our goal for staff to bring to you at the next meeting, hopefully a set of findings and a final version of the draft code for you to be reviewing. And so we want to open up the floor at this time to identify any other potential draft revisions or items of interest that the Planning Commission is focused on, so that we can ensure that we're coming to you fully prepared with any remaining items. I mean, at this point, with the conversations around public access ways and the native landscape buffer, staff has clarity for moving forward. So I'd like to open up to any other items that commissioners may be interested in hearing about, or other changes they're interested in.
We've exhausted them.
Maybe.
Well, hearing none, I guess I'll just briefly cover.
Commissioner Edwards.
Oh, thank you.
I don't have an item to add. I wanted to just state that I feel like this process, the clear and objective standards is very much intended to provide a pathway that is a relatively high bar for development. If you can meet all of these things, then it should be easy to develop. But we also do have the discretionary track. And so as I was listening to the deliberations in last meeting, it occurred to me that there was a lot of conversation just about trying to find this sweet spot that would pull in everything, like all of the different scenarios. And what if your property is this? And what if your property is that? And I found myself thinking, well, that's actually one of those circumstances that you might have to go with a discretionary track. And that's why there is that option. And so I kind of found myself feeling like you guys had really great, robust conversations in the last meeting. And I really really appreciate all of the fine tuning that you all have tried to do to just accommodate so many what ifs. But again, I just, I don't have so much heartburn with trying to accomplish this perfect policy, knowing that, it is not going to eliminate development in the Greenway, and that's not the purpose of it. And I think in just reading through so much of the testimony and everything, it was just like, that was something that I just wanted to kind of communicate. So I didn't have any really specifics that I felt like needed fine tuning, because to me, that's where that other tract is gonna, pick up the things that fall through the cracks. And I think that, where we've landed is pretty good to, we're going to continue to get public input, and council's going to get a lot of input. So hopefully they're able to move things.
I think it's really helpful that you two provided information about the 15-year history. It's helpful to me to put all of this in perspective, because overall, it's such a very, very small amount of land and property and lots. And the fact that there were only 37 applications over the last 15 years, and I think only 16 of those were housing. So it's not as if this is going to bring a huge wave suddenly of residential development along the river. And I think it's helpful to have the context for the whole project and the specifics that we're talking about. Some proportionate, some, like when Commissioner Isaacson first asked about numbers of lots and stuff, that bigger picture is helpful for me, and it might be helpful with the city council and the city council's public hearing, so that you can zoom in on this little fraction of area that we're actually talking about. Thanks.
The only thing I would ask is, I know that it's not germane to what we're talking about now, but it's ancillary, is we've hinted in the agenda packet that we're not talking about building height. And that's more of a citywide project. I see Alyssa's getting queued up. Do we have anything on the official schedule for when we might take that up? Because the public that doesn't necessarily get that this is a separate topic and feels it needs to be, even though we can't for the purposes of this conversation. But I think it's important to let them know when it will, as opposed to we promise in the future that it will happen.
So I'm going to talk specifically about River Road Santa Clara, because that is the neighborhood planning effort that is currently going on. Let me talk right into the microphone here. So I can't really look at you. That's right. It's challenging. Now I see what you guys are doing. Here we go. So we are actively having conversations with folks in that neighborhood, the neighborhood leaders, about what the adoption package will look like for that neighborhood plan. And building height, limiting building height in the commercial zones is something that we're actively talking about right now. So I think it makes more sense for that to be part of the neighborhood plan as opposed to being part of the Willamette Greenway, because it would be more extensive than just along the Greenway. And so timeline, our best guess is that we would be through that adoption package by the end of the year. And that's our estimate at this point.
Okay. Thank you. Can't see behind me, but does anybody have Commissioner Lear or Ramey? Do you have any additional? I can't see you. I apologize.
Their hands are not raised.
Okay. All right. So thank you for your input tonight and the robust discussion. We will be back on March 14th to continue our deliberations on the topic. Before we adjourn, are there any additional items or info to share from other commissioners or staff?
Did you have anything else? Were you done? Okay. I just have a couple of dates. I wanted to give you an update on some schedule things, and I will email this because it's it's a bunch of dates. So your next meeting is the 28th. It's going to be fully virtual. It will be an overview of the capital improvement program. And Gabe will be sitting in for me at that one because we have an urban reserves public hearing that night with the council and the county board. Late breaking news, but the March 7th meeting is being canceled. So that was a joint public hearing with Lane County and Springfield, and those materials are not going to be ready in time. So we're looking at a May hearing date. So we'll be sending out a poll for that one. We had sent out a poll for April, and it's not going to be ready by those dates either. So you can ignore those dates. Then that means our next meeting back here will be on March 14th, and we intend to have that meeting in person. That will be on the Greenway, and also we'll be sharing with you our work plan for the next year. I think that will be really useful information for you all to know what's going to be not only coming before you, but what's keeping all of our staff busy. And we're also going to. Well, I'm going to leave it on the calendar, but we're probably going to cancel the meeting on March 28th because that's spring break. And at this point, we don't have a topic for that one. So it's Bethel 4J and U of O spring break tends to be not a great time to hold meetings. So, and then we are filling in the April meeting dates as we speak.
And quick confirm.
Alyssa?
Yes.
Will we have the CIP prior to the February 28 meeting?
Yes, it will. The packet will be available a week before. I think the CIP is actually online. The budget committee is talking about it tomorrow. So if you want to get a head start, you can look on the budget committee webpage. Also, if you wanted to track, or anybody wants to keep tracking urban reserves, there's a work session at council tomorrow at noon. And then the joint public hearing between the council and the board of commissioners is on the 28th, and anticipated action early April. So that's actually really exciting to be close to wrapping that really big project up.
The meeting you mentioned before that was I'm just trying to be rescheduled. Is that the one where we had with county that was canceled, or we?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and what it is on is an update of the public facilities and services plan, which is, it's really a long range document that shows where we need to provide water, wastewater, and stormwater for undeveloped properties or underdeveloped areas. And so it's a jointly adopted document with Springfield and Lane County. So to make some of those changes, it's a joint process. And so those always just take a little bit longer. So that we'll be looking for a hearing date. We'll be sending you another poll for that one.
Great.
There.
Richard Pergola.
I'm wondering when the city's budgeting process is beginning and when is the time to provide input on needs for the planning department?
The budget process is starting right now. I can send you some dates and times about that.
Great, I would
Absolutely.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Not hearing anybody else, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you for all very, very much.